Very much. Thank you, LEC, for giving me the opportunity to present this talk. The work I'm going to present is actually I have no part with at all. I'm presenting on behalf of many other partners, and so the Lake Sturgeon work group's a little bit new. I think technically we're 2 years old, and so we have a lot of members that have come to our annual get together. Across several state agencies, federal and provincial. And then we also have we've had some contributions from outside universities, Toledo Zoo, and several more people from Fish and Wildlife Service. And so all these people sort of helped present, annual updates on all the lake sturgeon work that are going on in Lake Erie and the connecting channels. And so you can see there's quite a list here, and it includes a lot of partners. I was asked to present on 3 of these projects. The Eastern Basin Telemetry that's being done with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and New York State DEC. The Maumee Restoration Program, which has a huge list of collaborators. And then a very recent historic population assessment using a depletion-based model. And that was performed out of our Pennsylvania U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service office. So the Lake Erie lake sturgeon population was historically one of the largest in the Great Lakes, and there were 19 spawning populations based on historic data, and a lot of this historic data is based on sightings and various quality of information. And so we present this with a little bit of caution. Like, these are hopefully spawning populations, but we don't really have the same kind of proof that we gather today to determine spawning populations. Well, what you can see from the different colored dots is that we have a lot of extirpated and unknown populations, and basically the only populations we have are at the 2 ends in the Detroit and Buffalo area. And so the best data that we have on sturgeon in Lake Erie is from the commercial fishery that took place from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. And so this is just a figure showing how the fishery peaked around 1885 and quickly crashed, within a 15, 20-year time period. And so this sort of leads right into the first project that I was going to talk about. And so there's a very recent publication by Suika et al. It's the application of this depletion-based stock reduction analysis. And what's really neat about this analysis is that it develops actual life history parameters and uses that data to project forward and look at what the historic population was like. And so this is the big question here. So if the population was able to sustain some number of years of that catch, what was that virgin population size like? And so this is important. This can help give us guidance on moving forward. Obviously we'll never get back to then, but we can start setting benchmarks on what we'd anticipate seeing for a sturgeon population in Lake Erie. Jumping right into results, one of the outputs that it looked at is the biomass of the fishery. And so based on the parameters that it estimated, it came up with biomass required to sustain the MSY. And so this figure, you can see within 10 years, the fishery was depleted below the biomass target. And so that's a pretty quick impact from the harvest fishery. Similarly, when we look at the MSY generated from this model, you can see that the fishery operated well above MSY for a very long time. And so clearly another indication of overfishing. And then finally, one of the outputs from the model is the exploitation rate for maximum sustainable yield, and that's at basically 2.5%. And so because lake sturgeon are so long-lived and spawn so infrequently, also having a late maturity, these fish are very susceptible to overfishing. And so a lot of these fishery measurements are very conservative, very low. I mean, a 2.5 exploitation rate is pretty low. And so, looking back at what we were seeing in the historic archives, you can see that this was a pretty easy, clear-cut case of overfishing. Finally, I think this is probably the most meaningful part of this assessment, is that it projects forward, what should we have been seeing now that the fishery has stopped. And so what these graphs are some percentage of the carrying capacity. And so we can assume, the carrying capacity hasn't changed from back before the fishery to right now. So under those conditions and under the life history parameters that the model estimated, we should be all the way up here. I can't read that 15,000 metric tons of sturgeon in the lake, and clearly we are not there. And so and you go and you run this model and you keep going down. We look a lot more like this 10% K than any of these other ones. And so what that is suggesting is that something in the lake is limiting the carrying capacity. A lot of people jumped right away to suggest that, it's habitat's limiting it. Well, that's very true. After the fishery collapsed, there were a lot of dams were constructed in Lake Erie. And so it's pretty clear that there is limit to spawning habitat. But there's also invasive species, which increases the mortality rate on some of these fish, and there's other influences. But regardless of what it is, this analysis sort of suggests that something's still out there that's impacting lake sturgeon's ability to recover naturally. And I think I sort of said that all here. All right. So the next project that I'm going to talk about is the Eastern Basin telemetry. And as we'll hear, I think in a couple talks, the GLaDOS system is quite an amazing thing and opportunity to take advantage of. And this project's an example of how a very localized project was able to be a part of this larger science community and take advantage of these receivers that are out there. And so this project focused on the Buffalo Harbor and the Upper Niagara River. It was looking to identify spawning habitat use of the remnant population that was being monitored up there. But it was also looking at long-term seasonal movements. And so what you see here is just a list of fish that were tagged. Clearly 2016 was the best year that we had for tagging. We got 30 plus receivers, transmitters into sturgeon. What's happening moving forward is, most of these fish that were tagged were males. I think they only were able to tag 6 females. So moving forward, I think there's going to be a goal of tagging only females, just so that we get a little bit more diversity of data. But what's really neat here is you can see all these dots represent receivers that are out in the lake. And so in 2015, we had 19 fish. After they were released, they were detected within the Buffalo array. 17 of them were also detected at this array. And so they're moving somewhat. That's not, a huge distance. 4 of those 19 made it out to the Dunkirk line, and then 2 of them made it out to the Central Basin, or to the Long Point line at the edge of the Central Basin. And so if you remember back to the GLaDOS figure, there's a lot of receivers out in the Central Basin, and this was sort of the end point for these 2 fish. They made it out this far. Up in the Niagara River, we had no fish detected. In 2016, same sort of design here, we had 53 fish that were tagged and released and detected within that array. 46 of them were also detected on this array. 6 out here, and again, we had 2 that made it out to that last one. So what this is really showing is that there's not a lot of extensive movement. We have a few of them, but for the most part, the home ranges of these fish are fairly small and confined to this area here. Sort of a technical point on acoustic telemetry is that the range of these receivers can vary with certain conditions. So theoretically, if you had a very quiet situation, a fish sort of on the fringe of this array may actually get picked up in here. And so I think this 46 number, it's not that these fish are directly on that array, but they're just in that area. They're in the eastern basin, or I guess the sub-eastern basin. I don't know what that smaller area is called. And again, what's really interesting is none of those tagged fish went into the Niagara River. And so this is a question that I know people bring up a lot, and it's something that we're going to pursue specifically because there's a lot of recreation in the upper Niagara River. There's divers, there's fishermen, and they see sturgeon in there. So it's very clear to us that sturgeon are using the upper river, but apparently not any of the sturgeon that were tagged. Some of the other data that we can look at is finer scale, and this goes back to the question of spawning habitat. And not necessarily just spawning habitat, but with that smaller range, what are they doing within that smaller area? And so this figure, although it's hard to see, all these dots represent detections of sturgeon in a position. And so we have 2015 on the left side and 2016 on the right side. And so May is sort of the pre-spawn area. And so what you see is you see these fish hanging out quite a bit along this edge of the array. And that's where most of our catch happens, when we're catching them pre-spawn. And we also think that we suspected that it had something to do with the spawning location. But then you look at June and you start seeing, some movement up to here, some movement down to here. And it's very consistent. What you're gonna see is this seasonal, this monthly change in habitat use is consistent across years. And so then in July, this is now after the spawning period, you see that the fish have sort of split. They've gone up into this area, or they've gone out of the array along this edge, the southern edge. And then August, fish have either left the array or occupying this the northwest corner of the array. And then in September, they're still there. And so, this obviously suggests that there's some decent feeding habitat or some sort of conditions there that the sturgeon are queuing in on, and they're remaining there during non-spawning periods. But like I was saying, our effort was really to identify where fish were spawning. And so this is something that happened last year. We sort of we drove around and saw some habitat. Ed Roseman actually came out for a site tour, and he helped guide us with identifying what would be good sturgeon spawning habitat. And so we put out these egg mats in these 3 locations. This location here is where we have our highest catch rates for our sturgeon. And so it was, when we pull these sturgeon up, they're very mature and ready to spawn. So we assumed that the spawning area must be around here. So we set some egg mats there. There's a nice rock pile here that we set some egg mats on. And this area here is known as Bird Island Pier. And before the development of the Buffalo Harbor, there was literally an island there, and it was very rocky, had a lot of bedrock, fractured bedrock there. And so what remains is some of that. And so what this figure shows is that we did actually collect eggs in this area. And so this is the first time that reproduction's been confirmed in the Niagara area, and it happened on that Bird Island Pier. So hopefully in the future we'll look into some more areas where we can see where they're spawning. Okay, so my final project that I want to talk about is the Maumee River Restoration Program, and I believe most of you are already familiar with the process leading up to this point, so I didn't want to get into too much of the history, but basically we're Fish and Wildlife out of Detroit is working with many partners to develop this restoration program in the Maumee. And so in 2017, what they wanted to do is a pilot gamete collection, and so the restoration program is going to have a streamside rearing facility on the river, and that's going to be run by Toledo Zoo. And Fish and Wildlife with other partners are going to go and collect the gametes from the St. Clair. And so they wanted to go through the whole process in a pilot fashion so that they could see whether it works. And so this included, collecting a small number of males and females, going through the permitting, the collecting, the transportation, all of these things. And so They were able to get all the permits into place. They did a fish collection in early June, and they were able to collect 61 total fish in 2 days. They were able to get many ripe males and 7 black egg females. And so the gamete collection went well. They injected the females with some pituitary hormone. When they came back the next morning, one of the females spawned in the tank. And so they proceeded with egg collections from the other 3. And then similarly, they had 19 males with hormone injections, and they were able to collect from them. And so I didn't get a chance to find out why this 1.6% happened over here, but the eggs had they had some success with the eggs hatching and making it to fry, and so at this moment they have just over 5,000 fall fingerlings of those sturgeon. And so the idea, the take-home message Justin wanted me to share is that it was a success. They were able to do the process. Obviously, I'm sure this 1.6 is much lower than they want, so they'll probably work out what happened there and move forward from that point. So to finish up, I just wanted to sort of give an update of what we talked about at our last work group meeting. And basically, we wanted to talk about what were the objectives for Lake Sturgeon in Lake Erie. You know, what were things that we would like, you know, sort of the pie in the sky thing. What came out of some of that discussion is, you know, we're not really sure what habitat even exists out there. We have this list of historic tributaries, but they're not really based on the same quality of data that we work with these days. So we want to prioritize tributaries and identify them as possible restoration sites, and then develop a list of management actions that can help support the restoration. And all of this stuff will obviously be fed up into this group and discussed here. But as we move forward, we want to have our best knowledge and science ready for it. So that's it. Thank you.